Well, good morning. We are now going to be listening to the second part of Dr. Hruby's interview as he talks about his model for reading comprehension. So, as you listen to what he's saying, please remember that the relationship between language familiarity and symbolic reasoning um, uh, holds for any language in any dialect. So when he says better language use and less good language use, he's not talking about formally correct English versus other tongues or vernacular forms of American English. Rather, he's remembering that within any language or dialect, some users have larger vocabularies and more varied syntactic strategies than other users. So it's his contention that it is the development of that language familiarity within any given dialect that gives rise to symbolic reasoning, intellect, so to speak, uh, not the other way around. I really find it especially interesting as we listen to the elements of his own model that it really tracks nicely with some of the other models, and he'll be talking about other models of reading comprehension. So there does seem to be hope for finding a great deal of common ground in what researchers are saying about comprehension. So let's get ready to listen to what Dr. Hruby has to say about comprehension. And thank you for joining us. We'll jump on to new things, but this I think is a perfect breaking point. And what you've said about brain research, uh, I, you just had the audience, you had me enthralled, you had the audience enthralled, and I think it's just some of the things that are being said on social media just don't fit what the brain research is actually demonstrating.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. There's lots of uh, accidental misinformation, and sometimes I think intentional disinformation. Look at this image over here. Oh, it's like not, and this is what the brain-based people used to do as well. But all they were selling were the exact same theories that the cognitive psychologists had put together in the 1960s and 70s and 80s about reading. So they were just trying to rebrand it, make it sound more real, more proven by hard science, with clearly not a good grasp of how science works. Science is about you do your measurements, you look for patterns in the measurements, not in the real world. You create a model that explains how things work the way it does, and then when you're satisfied, you've got enough evidence to support that. Then you test it by trying to prove it false, not prove it true. And if you succeed in doing that, then it's back to the drawing board. You usually don't have to throw it out entirely, but you have to tweak it and see if you get it to work better. And that's why science is so slow. That's why it takes so many studies to get to ever more certain knowledge. And but sometimes you do have to. Occasionally, a really bright graduate student or brand new professor comes along and finds out with a way to turn the whole tables over. And the reason is usually because we were not using enough our assumptions that we began with weren't adequate, that the measures that we had were so limited, and there was so much that we weren't measuring and so many things we weren't paying attention to, that it's back to the drawing board for sure. So,
Okay, and I think this would be, I'm going to jump on you and do things a little bit about out of order, but I want to find out a bit about your model of reading comprehension and oh, how does reading work given your model, and how does it compare to other models of reading comprehension? So I'm going to throw that one at you.
okay, well, in that case, let me see here. Let me see what I can come up with. I know I've got some slides somewhere. I'm a professor. I've always got slides. In the old days, they used to have acetates, but now, okay, here we go. I'm coming up on it. Here we go. All right. Uh, and let's see if I can. No, wait a minute. It's just you can just cut out all this blabbing around. Oh, here we go.
Oh
Share
yeah, absolutely.
screen.
When we divide it into two things, here we go. But here we go.
All right. All right. So we talked about the simple view of reading, right? R is equal to D times C. And what that means, I mean, yes, it's a simple model, but Goff and Tunmer back in 1986 came up with that model. It was published in a journal for special education practitioners. And the point of the model was just to remind them that reading is not just about decoding, nor is it just about reading stories to kids. It's about both decoding skills development and language comprehension development. If either of those things is weak, it will bring down the entire score. That was, or you could be a little weak at both. And so, on the basis of a weak score, you can't tell if the problem is decoding or language comprehension or what. So that's an issue. And I'm sure many of the viewers here will be familiar with things like Scarborough's rope. And you'll notice here again, you've got your decoding and which is in blue here, and language comprehension, which is in red. But on the left-hand side, you can see all the subcomponents there: background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, and so on. And for word recognition, which is decoding, right? Phonological awareness, sight recognition, which is right, visual word form area right there. So those are those two blobs that we saw in the brain there, right? Except in this case, it's reversed where the decoding stuff is at the bottom instead of the top dorsal pathway. Here is Nell Duke and Cartwright's model, active view of reading, more recent. But again, you see word recognition and language comprehension distinguished, okay? Here you've got Donna Scanlon and her colleagues' work. And I've taken the liberty of color coding her model, and the green stuff there is basically your comprehension processes. The red stuff is your decoding processes. And off to the side, I love the importance of this: motivation and engagement. This is what life is all about. If you don't have your kids engaged in what they're doing, enjoying what they're doing, being interested and taken up with what they're doing, teaching kids is a tough row to hoe. And you know that, Sam. So I don't need to stress that. But this is Barb Foreman and her colleagues' work. This is looking at second graders. And what she's looking at are the tests for reading and comprehension and decoding processes and all of the sub processes that can be tested on the left-hand side there. On the right, the yellow, that's a all-purpose reading comprehension test. And she's looking to see how well the subcomponents predict the higher order components. And for these second graders, you can see that comprehension and decoding predict reading comprehension just about equally, a little bit of an advantage to the language comprehension side of things. Phonological awareness is the circle right below the red decoding circle. And that doesn't show a significant correlation. In fact, it shows a negative correlation with reading comprehension. Now, if you looked at her work from kindergarten, it would be very important. Well, how does phonological awareness cease to be important? And the answer has to do with the fact that when statisticians say something predicts something else, they mean it correlates. That it means the two things go on at the same time. So if you know the one thing is happening, you can predict the other thing is happening, but they're not predicting the future, right? So there has to be a correlation between the two. And the distribution of scores for reading comprehension is usually a normal curve, the inverted bell curve. But by second grade, phonological awareness is just about all the kids got it perfectly. It's not that big a deal. Time you get to fourth grade, the same thing is going to happen to decoding fluency. This isn't looking at struggling readers. This is looking at all readers in general. That decoding, it will cease to predict the outcome on the reading comprehension test because they will have mastered it. Here's Charles Perfetti and his gang at Pittsburgh. You can see the same idea between decoding and language system, phonological systems, and linguistic systems arriving at reading comprehension. And the point he makes is that students who struggle with reading are stuck on that blue area, that decoding area of sounding out, and they aren't making the transition to reading, sight word reading for reading comprehension. Jean Shaw at Harvard a long time ago made this point. She called it getting, you need to get unglued from the text and its letter representations to see through it to the language and meaning itself. So those are other models. So what I try to address is just the issue of language comprehension, because I'm very unhappy about the legislative mandates that are occurring in across the United States, state after state, mandating that programs be used for early elementary reading instruction that are focused almost entirely on phonics, synthetic phonics driven decoding skill training. And the idea that language comprehension is just going to take care of itself naturally is a misnomer. The whole language people used to say that about decoding; it would just develop naturally. Nothing, I mean, everything develops naturally. It's a neurological process, right? But we facilitate that development with what we do in schools. So language needs to be facilitated along with decoding. So here's how it works, because language development begins in the earliest months and years of life. You're born into a linguistic environment, and from that you derive your language familiarity. And anyone who's had a kid or been a caregiver for an infant who goes through this phase, it's just fascinating, to watch how children kind of touch and go, stumble their way towards, sounds, and then single words or two-word sentences, cookie give and that kind of thing, or wah for water, and they make their way towards eventually developing grammatical sentences, and it's just almost miraculous to watch. Are they born with a language? No. Are they born with a propensity to develop a language? Yes. And as they develop that language, they feed back into the linguistic environment, enriching it further, getting feedback from their parents, caregivers, their older brothers, and so on. Uh, Now, the thing about language familiarity is that as you develop skills with language, it forces you to develop reasoning skills, symbolic reasoning. And this is important because symbolic reasoning is what you're measuring when you measure a child's intelligence. And all of our end of year standardized tests, like our standardized reading test, are symbolic in nature. And they're all G weighted, G for Spearman's correlate for general intelligence. And that's what gives them their reliability, without which they wouldn't be valid and therefore would be useless as a test. So, uh, and are you born with your intelligence? No. Is in terms of it being symbolic reasoning, no. You right, but the first and most paramount symbol system you have to develop is language, and that is a symbol system, right? Those sound patterns, those words are symbols. The grammatical relationship is a symbolic system, and you have to develop that ability. And as you do so, you eventually can use symbolic reasoning for other things like math or kinesthetic relationship. So as I was saying, it develops a symbolic reasoning. That's why IQ tests are not predictive of how a child is going to do in school until they're about 6 or 7 years of age, whereas language development tests are predictive by around age 4 or so. Uh, so, but we don't just use language and reason symbolically. We use language and reason symbolically about stuff, and that stuff becomes our prior knowledge base. And all of this is recursive. As you develop knowledge of the world, it further challenges our symbolic reasoning, which further challenges our linguistic articulation, and further then challenges our conversations with the linguistic environment, which is to say other people in the world. It's a very social process, very emotional process, the ability to communicate. We're not the only species that has the capacity to communicate with sounds, or to organize coordinated behaviors with others with sounds. Other species do that as well, but we're the only species that does so symbolically, that uses arbitrary sound patterns to represent aspects of our lived experience and then relate them grammatically.
I'm going
So
to interrupt you
yeah,
there and just ask you to repeat that, because that is such an, I don't want that to slide by.
sure. Sure. Well, you often hear that literacy is social. Well, yeah, it's social. We're a social species. Everything we do is social in some sense, but we're not the only social species. All primates are social. There's some other species as well, and they don't have literacy. So it may tell you something about how we're social, but it doesn't tell you very much about literacy. And communication. Most species communicate with other species, with other members of their own species, and do so to coordinate behaviors. Slime mold cells do that, and certainly birds do. And there are species of birds that learn their bird song, that they aren't born with it. They actually learn it. And the gene that allows them to do that, the FOXP2 gene, is the same gene that's active in humans that allow us to do that. And so the questions of how we were able to, because chimps, our closest species relative, don't have this ability, but we have the ability to use sound, but we use it for symbolic representation. And in other words, the sound patterns are completely arbitrary. That's why we have so many different languages. And the grammatical relationships are as well. There's some basics that seem to be universal, but otherwise not. And we can do this because of the brain. We can do it because if you look at our cerebral cortex, it's not that much larger than you would expect, but it is far more dense neurologically, and it's laminated. It's like there's multiple levels, and it's just, I mean, it's what allows us to engage in such complex behavior. And as a result, we see the world in a much finer grained way than we would otherwise. And that's what allows our knowledge to be as complex as it is. And that's what powers us. So this is why language and literacy is so fundamental. So if you're teaching a kid to read, you're not just teaching them how to make sounds from looking at letters. You're teaching them how to reason symbolically. You're teaching them how to develop prior knowledge. You're making them smarter, not only more knowledgeable, but more intelligent. You are. And these things correlate between good language users and not so good language users. And so it gives us a key on how we might address that in early childhood. So that's my little 2 cents there.
Okay.
I should say that model was published in Kaplan back in January of 2020. And 5 months later, 6 months later, Dave Pearson and his colleagues came out with a report called Reaping the Fruits of the Reading for Understanding Initiative, which was a major nationwide reading comprehension funded by IES initiative. And they reviewed all of this research. We're talking, gosh, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies done by dozens of research centers and scores of researchers and probably thousands of graduate students. And they came to the conclusion of the exact same 4 components. A linguistic environment, they refer to it as a sociocultural environment, which is a broader category. That's kind of a catch-all. But we're talking about language development. You want to focus on the linguistic environment, I think, most primarily. Secondly, language familiarity. Thirdly, comprehension strategies, which is basically your symbolic reasoning. For young kids, it's going to be more fundamental. It's going to be stuff like inference, pattern recognition, accurate categorical analysis, and that sort of thing. But most of the research in reading that's been done on cognitive strategies for improved comprehension are done on middle schoolers. So they already have that stuff in the bag. That what they're developing are more structured things like you would learn in a content area reading class. So that's your third category. And your fourth, of course, prior knowledge. So when you hear people say, we have to stop emphasizing language, we have to focus on prior knowledge, that how are you going to teach prior knowledge without language? The better the language, the better they're going to be able to glean new knowledge to increase their prior knowledge. So I just offer that as a commentary, but that's a kind of a confirmation of the model. No great shapes, like all model, very simplistic, and let's see someone prove it false.
Okay. We're about to make a little bit of Bomarito history here, because watching the clock again, decided that was the end of part 2, and there's going to be a part 3.
Okay, that completes part 2. Um, Now we're getting ready for part 3, and I want to note that when Dr. Hruby talked about money and following the money during his presentation at LitCon, he had the audience enthralled, including me. Okay, so next week he's going to share some of those insights with us. So please do stay tuned for part 3. I think you're going to find part 3 to be both informative and important. So we'll see you next week as we continue with this and do part 3. Till then, signing off.